Christopher Nolan's movie, The Odyssey, presents Odysseus as a flesh-and-blood warrior, sailing through storms, wars, and monsters on his desperate journey home. Matt Damon's Odysseus fights a Cyclops, encounters witches, and survives seas apparently controlled by angry gods. It looks enormous, physical, and strangely believable, which raises an obvious question. Did any of this actually happen? Was Odysseus a real king? Was there genuinely a Trojan War? Did Greek sailors encounter places that later became stories about sirens, giants, and sea monsters? Or is the Odyssey simply one of humanity's oldest fantasy stories? The frustrating answer is that the Odyssey is neither straightforward history nor complete invention. Its central adventure is almost certainly fictional, but the world underneath that adventure contains fragments of real places, real conflicts, and memories from a civilization that had already disappeared by the time the poem reached its final form. To understand that, we first need to separate three different things: the poem, the period in which it is set, and the period in which it was actually composed. The Odyssey is traditionally attributed to Homer, and was probably shaped into something close to its surviving form during the 8th or 7th century BCE. But its story takes place around the end of the Bronze Age, perhaps roughly 500 years earlier. That means Homer was describing a world as distant from him as the early 1500s are from us today. Imagine someone today writing a detailed story about a warrior who lived during the reign of Henry VIII. Now imagine that most written records had vanished, and the story had survived mainly because generations of performers memorized it, retold it, and changed parts of it for hundreds of years. That is roughly the problem we face with the Odyssey. The story traveled through a long oral tradition before being written down. Real memories may have survived, but they became mixed with later weapons, customs, politics, and beliefs. Scholars have found plenty of anachronisms, meaning that Homer's world is not a perfect picture of any single historical period. But the most important part of the background may genuinely be rooted in history. Troy was a real place. For centuries, many people assumed Troy was simply legendary. Then excavations at Hisarlik in modern Turkey revealed a settlement that had existed in several different forms for thousands of years. Archaeologists found fortification walls, buildings, and multiple layers of destruction and rebuilding. The site is now widely accepted as the location behind ancient Troy. That does not prove Homer's Trojan War happened exactly as described. Archaeology cannot show us Helen being taken from Sparta, Achilles fighting Hector, or Greek soldiers hiding inside a wooden horse. In fact, the British Museum notes that there is no clear evidence that the specific war described by Homer actually occurred. What archaeology does show is that Troy was an important fortified settlement positioned close to routes connecting the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. Controlling trade and shipping in that region would have made it strategically valuable. A conflict over wealth, territory, or access to those routes is far more historically plausible than an entire international war being launched because one prince ran away with another king's wife. There are also intriguing written clues from the Hittite Empire, the great power that controlled much of Anatolia during the Late Bronze Age. Hittite documents mention a western region called Wilusa, which many scholars connect with Ilios, another Greek name for Troy. They also mention a foreign power called Ahiawa, commonly associated with the Mycenaean Greeks. These records suggest that Greek-speaking powers and kingdoms in Western Anatolia really did compete, negotiate, and occasionally fight. So there may have been one conflict involving Troy, or perhaps several smaller conflicts that later merged into the legend of one enormous 10-year war. This is how legends often form. Several rulers become one king, several battles become one war, several generations of heroes are squeezed into the same story, and an argument over trade becomes a romantic catastrophe involving the most beautiful woman in the world. The Greek side of Homer's world was real as well. Long before classical Athens or Sparta became famous, Greece contained powerful Mycenaean kingdoms centered around fortified palace complexes such as Mycenae and Pylos. These societies had rulers, soldiers, ships, bronze weapons, international trade, and complex bureaucracies. Archaeologists have uncovered palaces filled with storage rooms, workshops, and administrative tablets. These kingdoms communicated with other powers across the Eastern Mediterranean and were wealthy enough to organize military expeditions overseas. Homer's idea of Greek kings combining their forces against a city across the Aegean is therefore not impossible, even though we cannot confirm that Agamemnon commanded one united Greek army. Then, around 1200 BCE, this palace civilization collapsed. Major centers were destroyed, or abandoned. Writing disappeared from much of Greece, populations declined, and the political system changed dramatically. The exact causes remain debated, but warfare, migration, internal instability, famine, and disruption of trade may all have contributed. This collapse matters because the Odyssey is fundamentally a story about the aftermath of war. Its heroes return to kingdoms that have changed while they were away. Some are murdered, some lose control of their households. Others wander for years through a broken, violent world. That emotional background may preserve something real. Even if Odysseus himself never existed, people living through the collapse of the Bronze Age would have known about warriors who failed to return, rulers who lost their power, and communities cut off by the destruction of old trade networks. So what about Odysseus? Ithaca is a real Greek island, and it was inhabited during the Bronze Age. But there is no archaeological inscription saying, Odysseus lived here, complained about Poseidon, and returned home after 20 years. No contemporary document confirms that a king named Odysseus ruled Ithaca or took part in a war against Troy. There have been attempts to identify archaeological remains on Ithaca with Odysseus's palace, but none has produced universal agreement. Even if archaeologists eventually found the residence of a Bronze Age ruler there, connecting that person directly to Homer's Odysseus would be extremely difficult. Odysseus may have begun as the memory of a real ruler. He may combine several different warriors and folktale heroes. He may also be entirely fictional, a character created to explore intelligence, pride, loyalty, and survival. Unlike Achilles, who usually solves problems by being the strongest man within stabbing distance, Odysseus survives through deception. He lies, disguises himself, invents identities, and manipulates enemies. He tells the Cyclops that his name is Nobody, escapes beneath sheep, and later returns to Ithaca disguised as a beggar. That does not make him a historical person, but it does make him a believable product of the world that created him. In a dangerous society without modern states, passports, or reliable communication, identity could be flexible. A traveler arriving on a distant island might be a merchant, refugee, pirate, soldier, or spy, and the locals had very few ways to verify his story. The poem's concern with hospitality also reflects a real problem. In the Odyssey, strangers repeatedly arrive at unfamiliar households and ask for food, shelter, and protection. Good hosts are rewarded. Bad hosts, such as the Cyclops, violate the rules of civilized behavior. Hospitality was not simply ancient Greek politeness. In a world without hotels, embassies, or emergency services, travelers survived through networks of obligation. Refusing hospitality could be dangerous, but trusting the wrong visitor could be equally disastrous. The poem turns this fragile social system into one of its central moral tests. Once Odysseus leaves the recognizable world around Troy and Greece, however, the geography becomes increasingly difficult to treat as history. Some places in the story are undeniably real. Troy, Ithaca, Sparta, and Pylos existed. But the islands of Circe and Calypso, the land of the Lotus Eaters, the island of the Cyclopes, and the home of the Phaeacians cannot be securely located. For centuries, writers and historians have attempted to draw Odysseus's route on a modern map. Different versions send him towards Sicily, Italy, North Africa, Malta, Spain, and even the Atlantic Ocean. The problem is that Homer's geography does not behave like a modern navigation chart. The story blends recognizable Mediterranean features with imaginary islands and supernatural spaces. Scylla and Charybdis were later associated with the Strait of Messina between Sicily and mainland Italy. The narrow passage has strong currents and whirlpools, so it is easy to imagine sailors turning those dangers into monsters. But Homer himself does not clearly identify the location, and the connection with Messina became established later. The same caution applies to the Cyclops. Some people have suggested that ancient Greeks found elephant or mammoth skulls and mistook the large central nasal cavity for the eye socket of a one-eyed giant. Others argue that the Cyclops represents isolated pastoral communities that rejected Greek laws and hospitality. These are interesting theories, but they are not proof. We have no ancient notebook explaining where the idea came from. Polyphemus may simply belong to a much older folktale tradition about a hero trapped by a giant, versions of which appear in different cultures. The Sirens are even less historical. Their song offers Odysseus forbidden knowledge, promising to tell him everything that happened at Troy and across the world. They are not merely dangerous women performing an aggressively effective sea shanty. They represent temptation, the desire to know something even when gaining that knowledge will destroy you. Circe turning men into pigs is obviously not an eyewitness account, but the episode reflects anxieties about foreign lands, powerful women, intoxication, and the loss of human identity. Calypso's island represents another kind of danger. Not death, but comfort, so complete that Odysseus might abandon his home permanently. Even the gods work this way. Athena and Poseidon constantly interfere with Odysseus's journey, but their presence does not automatically make the story meaningless as history. Ancient Greeks understood weather, luck, illness, and disaster partly through divine action. A storm destroying a fleet was real. Sailors drowning far from shore were real. The belief that Poseidon caused the storm belonged to the religious explanation of the time. Behind the supernatural storytelling, sea travel in the ancient Mediterranean was genuinely dangerous. Ships were relatively small. Navigation depended heavily on experience and weather, and crews often stayed close to coastlines. Storms, reefs, currents, hunger, piracy, and hostile communities could turn a journey lasting weeks into a catastrophe. The poem exaggerates those dangers into monsters and divine punishments, but the fear underneath them is authentic. For ancient audiences, the sea was not a blue holiday background. It was a massive, unpredictable space where people regularly vanished. There is another reason we should be suspicious of Odysseus's adventures. He narrates many of them himself. The Cyclops, Circe, the Sirens, and the journey to the underworld are largely presented as stories Odysseus tells to the Phaeacians. And Odysseus is established throughout the poem as an extraordinarily skilled liar. That does not necessarily mean Homer expects us to dismiss everything, but it introduces a clever uncertainty. Odysseus may be describing genuine experiences within the world of the poem, or he may be giving his hosts the greatest "you would not believe what happened to me" story ever performed after dinner. His adventures also follow the familiar rhythm of sailors' tales. The lands become stranger as they move farther from home. Foreign people become giants or magicians. Dangerous coastlines become monsters. An island where a crew rested for months becomes a place where time itself seems to disappear. By the time these tales passed through generations of singers, ordinary shipwrecks could easily become battles against gods. The final part of the Odyssey, where Odysseus returns to Ithaca, may actually tell us more about ancient society than all the monsters combined. Odysseus discovers that wealthy men have occupied his home, consumed his livestock, and pressured Penelope to choose a new husband. His absence has created a political crisis. Without the king, there is no clear authority capable of removing them. This reflects a world where government was deeply personal. Power belonged to households, alliances, and individual rulers rather than large permanent institutions. If a king vanished for 20 years, there was no government website where his family could check whether he remained legally employed. Penelope's weaving, the management of livestock, the loyalty of servants, and the struggle over marriage all concern control of the household. The palace is not simply Odysseus's home. It is the economic and political center of his kingdom. The violent killing of the suitors should not be treated as proof of a real massacre, but it reflects the poem's values, restoring order, punishing violations of hospitality, and re-establishing the rightful household. So how much of the Odyssey is really true? The monsters are almost certainly mythology. There is no evidence that a one-eyed giant imprisoned Odysseus, that Circe transformed sailors into pigs, or that supernatural singers lured ships onto rocks. The 10-year journey is probably fictional as well. A reasonably direct voyage from Troy to Ithaca would not take a decade unless the captain were navigating with the strategic confidence of someone repeatedly throwing his map into the sea. Odysseus himself cannot be confirmed as a historical person. His palace has not been securely identified, and no contemporary record connects him with Troy. But the foundations of the story are much harder to dismiss. Troy existed. Mycenaean kingdoms existed. Greeks traveled and fought across the Aegean. Those kingdoms collapsed around the period in which the story is set, leaving behind generations of warfare, migration, and disrupted communities. The poem also preserves authentic concerns from the ancient Mediterranean: the danger of sea travel, the instability of kingship, the importance of hospitality, the vulnerability of households during war, and the difficulty of returning home after years of violence. That is the real truth inside of the Odyssey. It is probably not the biography of one man. It is a civilization remembering its own lost world. Over centuries, Real cities became legendary kingdoms. Battles became a 10-year war. Shipwrecks became divine punishment, and dangerous strangers became giants and witches. Homer, or the long tradition represented by Homer, did not preserve history in the way a modern historian would. He preserved history the way human memory often does, inaccurately in the details, but powerfully in the fears, losses, and experiences underneath them. So no, Odysseus probably did not blind a Cyclops and spend years being personally bullied by the god of the sea. But somewhere beneath the monsters and magic, there may have been real warriors who sailed east, fought near Troy, and struggled to return to homes that no longer recognized them. And that possibility is what makes the Odyssey more fascinating than either pure history or pure fantasy. It is a myth built on the ruins of a real world.